The coffee was black as creek mud and hot enough to blister. Nora Caldwell poured it slow, the way you pour anything worth keeping without spilling a drop. The porch boards groaned under Silas Thorne's weight. He sat on the top step, his back broad enough to block the morning wind. Both hands wrapped around a tin cup she'd handed him 20 minutes ago without a word. He hadn't thanked her. She hadn't expected it. Down the slope, the irrigation channel ran clear. An hour ago, it had been a brown mess of churned mud and broken planks, somebody's midnight work with an axe. Silas had walked down in the dark, found a deadfall log heavy enough to need a team of oxen, and dragged it to the gap barehanded. She'd watched from the window, hadn't gone out to help. He didn't need help. He needed to be left alone to do what he was going to do anyway. Now the water moved right, and the lower field would drink today. "You keep letting a known lunatic sit on your porch," Silas said, not looking at her, "and you're going to end up dying alone." Nora set the coffee pot down on the rail. She picked up her own cup. She didn't look at him either. "Only if you don't ask," she said. He turned his head then. Just slightly. The scar running from his jaw to his collar caught the early light, pale as birch bark against the rest of him. His eyes moved to her face, and whatever he found there made him set his cup down on the step with more care than the tin deserved. He opened his mouth. The gate latch rang like a shot. 3 men came through it, broad-shouldered and grinning the way men grin when they've already decided what they're going to do. One carried a hammer. One carried a board. The third, the one in the good coat, the one whose boots hadn't seen a day of honest mud, pulled a printed notice from inside his jacket and held it up high. "Mrs. Caldwell," his voice carried, meant to. "This here's a courtesy call from Mayor Vance's office." The man with the hammer stepped to the gatepost. He drove a nail. One stroke, then a second. Then he stepped back to let the sign hang level. "Notice of debt recovery by order of Mayor Harlan Vance." Nora did not move from where she stood. The coffee cup sat warm in both hands. She watched the sign swing once settle. Silas hadn't moved either. He was still on the step. But his shoulders had changed the way a horse's shoulders change the moment before it bucks. "You've got until sundown the 30th, the man in the good coat said. He was smiling. "That gives you—" "I know how to count," Nora said. He kept smiling. Something behind it didn't. He looked at Silas, then the way you look at a stray dog you're not sure is chained. "You'd do well to remind your guest that squatters hold no rights in Oakhaven County." They left the gate open when they went. Nora stood on the porch and listened to their boots fade down the road. The channel kept running below. A meadowlark called once from the fence line and went quiet. The coffee in her hands had started to cool. Silas picked up his cup again. Neither of them spoke. But when she looked at the sign nailed to her gate, both her hands had gone white around the tin, and it had nothing to do with the cold. The notice stayed on the gate. Nora left it there on purpose. By Tuesday, half of Oakhaven had read it. By Wednesday, they'd made up their minds about what it meant. She knew the moment she stepped into Greer's general store, and the talking stopped. Not gradually, all at once, the way a flock of birds lifts off a wire. 3 women near the dry goods counter turned their backs in the same breath. Old Greer himself moved slow to the far end, found something to arrange on a shelf that didn't need arranging. "Half-pound of 10-penny nails?" Nora said. "And a spool of fence wire." Greer didn't turn around. "Fresh out," he said. The shelf in front of him held 4 boxes of 10-penny nails. She could read the labels from where she stood. She set her coins on the counter, picked up her empty basket, walked out. The walk home was 2 miles of open road, and she didn't look at her feet once. She looked at the ridgeline. Iron Ridge sat gray and still above the pines, and somewhere up in that gray stillness, Silas Thorne was doing whatever Silas Thorne did during the hours when the rest of the world pretended he didn't exist. He came down that night, same as the others. She heard him before she saw him. A low creak from the east fence line, then the particular sound of a post being driven. Not hammered. Driven with something heavier than a hammer, and only once per post, which meant he was using his hands wrapped around the post itself and dropping his full weight behind it. She'd figured that out on the third night. She'd stopped going to the window to check. By morning, the east line held posts sunk 18 inches into clay. She'd tested one with both hands and couldn't make it shift. She spent the daylight hours at her table with scissors and thread. Silas's coat, the one he'd left on the porch rail 2 weeks back without explanation, was good wool gone to ruin at every seam. She took it apart to its pieces and put it back together the way it should have been built the first time. Flat-felled seams, double-stitched cuffs. She cut the collar from scratch using the worn pattern she kept folded in the tobacco tin under her sewing box. It wasn't charity. She didn't think of it that way, and she didn't think he would either. She found uses for the scraps. Nothing in this house went to waste. Nothing had gone to waste since the winter her husband died, and she'd learned exactly how thin the margin was between surviving and not. In town, Vance was talking. She heard it secondhand through the Methodist minister's wife, who still nodded to her in the road, the only one who did. He was telling people Silas had broken Jake Purdy's wagon axle, which was true. He left out that Purdy had been drunk driving along her fence line at midnight, and that the axle had been cracked long before it met the rut that finished it. He was telling people Silas had threatened the Connolly brothers. She didn't know if that was true or not. She suspected the Connolly brothers had given him reason. He was building something Vance was. She could feel the shape of it, the way you feel weather coming, a pressure change slow and certain. Thursday morning she woke before light and lay still listening. From out back, nothing. She dressed and went to the barn. The door stood open. The stall was empty. Her mare, the dun with the white sock on her left foreleg, the animal that pulled the wagon she used twice a week to haul produce to the Millfield market, the only income that stood between her and Vance's notice, lay on her side in the straw. She did not move when Nora stepped in. She would not move again. Nora knelt in the straw beside her and put one hand flat on the animal's neck. Still warm. Not long. The smell hit her then sharp and wrong underneath the hay. Something added to the water bucket. Something deliberate. Her hand stayed on the mare's neck for a long time. Outside, the sun came up anyway. She didn't go inside for water. She didn't go inside at all. She stayed in the barn until the straw under her knees soaked through her skirt, and her legs went cold, and her hands stopped shaking, or something close enough to stopped, that she could stand without gripping the stall wall. Then she went outside and sat in the mud beside the barn door and looked at nothing in particular. The lower field needed turning by Friday. She had no animal to pull the plow. The Millfield run was Saturday morning, and she had no wagon team to make it. The debt notice on her gate had a date on it, the 30th, and the 30th was 9 days away, and 9 days ago she had still had a horse. She heard Silas on the ridge path before she saw him. His footfall had a particular weight to it, heavier on the left, and she'd learned it the way you learn the sound of your own roof in wind without deciding to. He came around the corner of the barn and stopped. He looked at the open door. He looked at her sitting in the mud. He didn't say anything. He went inside. She listened to him move around in there. It didn't take long. There wasn't much to look at. When he came back out, his jaw was set so hard the muscle in his cheek stood out like a knot in pine. His hands were open at his sides. Then they weren't. They closed slow into fists, and he turned his face toward the road that led down to Oakhaven, and a sound came out of him low in his chest that didn't belong to anything tame. He crossed to the porch in 4 strides. The rifle was inside on the rack above the door. She knew that was where he was going before his hand touched the latch. She moved faster than she'd moved in months. She came off the ground and crossed the yard and hit the porch steps at a run and got her hand around the barrel just as he cleared the doorframe. The metal was cold. Her palm was bleeding from somewhere she didn't know when that had happened. He was a full head taller than her. He looked down at her with eyes that had gone a color she hadn't seen in them before, past anger, past sense somewhere further back than both. She did not let go of the barrel. "Not this way," she said. He pulled. Not hard, not yet, but she felt the intention behind it, the gathered weight of a man who had decided. "They killed her," he said. The words came out flat and quiet, which was worse than if he'd shouted them. "I know. They did it to get to me. To get me to, I know what they did it for." Her hand tightened on the barrel. "And if you walk down that road right now, you give them exactly what they built this for. You understand me? They need you to do this. It's the only way they win clean." His breath came through his nose in two hard pulls. His eyes moved from the road back to her face. She held his gaze and didn't soften it. Slowly, the way a thing falls that's too heavy to fall fast, his grip on the stock loosened. She took the rifle, set it inside against the doorframe. Then she reached down and pulled up the loose board in the hallway floor, the one that had always sat a half-inch proud of the rest, the one her husband had nailed down wrong, and she'd never fixed because she'd found a better use for the space beneath it. The iron box was heavier than it looked. She used both hands. She held it out to him. He looked at it, then at her. "What's in it?" he said. "Everything while..." She said, "That you already know." His eyes changed. Something moved through them, recognition, and behind recognition, something she hadn't seen in this yard since before her husband's funeral. He took the box. They came at sundown. Nora heard the horses first, not one or two, but many hooves on dry road, the particular rhythm of men riding in a group that has already made its decision before it left the stable. She was at the stove. She set the lid back on the pot, wiped her hands on her apron, and went to the window. 23. She counted them twice. Vance rode at the front on his gray, and beside him the sheriff sat his horse with the look of a man who knew he was doing something he'd have to live with. Behind them came the rest storekeepers, ranch hands, two of the Connolly brothers' men, who'd nodded to her in the road 6 months ago, and now rode with rifles laid across their saddles like it meant nothing. They stopped at the gate. The notice was still nailed to the post. Vance swung down and pushed the gate open himself, which told her he wanted the theater of it, the formal entry, the authority of a man who opens doors that aren't his. "Caldwell." His voice reached the window clean. "By order of Oakhaven County, this property reverts to municipal debt recovery. Any person or persons found to be obstructing..." Silas came out of the back room. He'd been at the table for the last 2 hours, with the iron box open, the ledger books laid flat, his finger moving down columns of figures in the lamplight. He hadn't spoken. She hadn't needed him to. She'd been writing her own letters at the other end of the table, folding them, sealing them, the last one sealed just before dark, when she'd heard the first horse on the road. He looked at her now, she looked at him. He put on the coat she'd rebuilt, the one with the flat-felled seams and the new collar. He buttoned it from the bottom up, slow and even. Then he opened the front door and walked out onto the porch with his hands at his sides and nothing in them. The crowd went still. It was not the stillness of men who are calm. It was the stillness of men who expected a thing and got something else entirely and hadn't yet decided what to do with that. Silas stood in the doorframe and said nothing. He was big enough that the frame seemed built for him, no space to spare on either side. The last of the sunlight caught the side of his face and the scar along his jaw. He looked at Vance the way a man looks at arithmetic. He's already finished. Vance recovered first. He always did. That was how men like him stayed men like him. "Where's the woman?" he said. Nora stepped out and stood beside Silas. She carried the storm lantern in her right hand. She'd lit it inside before she came out, and it burned steady in the still air, no flicker, a clean, even flame. She set it on the porch rail. She folded her hands in front of her. She did not look at the rifles. She looked at Vance. His smile came back, but it took a half-second longer than it should have. "You've got nothing," he said. "No horse, no income, no legal standing, and you've been harboring a man with a warrant outstanding in 2 counties. He turned to the crowd, then playing to them the way he always played to them. "I've given this woman every courtesy. She's chosen—" "You've given her a dead horse," Silas said. The words dropped into the quiet and sat there. Someone's mount shifted its weight. A bridle rang once and went silent. Vance's smile didn't move, but his eyes did just slightly toward the sheriff, a flicker so fast most men would miss it. Nora had not missed it. She looked at the crowd lined up along her fence line, rifles and all, and she felt her own breathing slow, even each one deliberate. Her hands were folded and still, because she knew something every one of those 23 men did not. She had known it for 3 weeks. She had been waiting for exactly this moment to let them find out. Silas reached back through the doorway and brought out the iron box. He set it on the porch rail beside the lantern, opened the latch. The ledger books inside were 3 of them, thin and water-stained at the corners, filled margin to margin, in a hand so small and precise it looked like printing from a press. He picked up the first one and held it out toward the crowd. "Oak Haven Savings and Land Trust," he said. "Account ledger. Fiscal years 1881 through 1884. His voice carried the same way Vance's did, built for open air, built to reach the back row. 31 land parcels recorded as forfeit for unpaid debt. 26 of those parcels transferred within 60 days to a holding company called Crestline Property." He turned one page. "Crestline Property, sole registered owner, Harlan Vance." Nobody moved. "That's forgery," Vance said. His voice came out level, but his horse felt something change in him. It stepped sideways and he pulled it hard. "That's the work of a lunatic who's been sitting on that mountain inventing—" "I didn't invent the accounts," Silas said. "I kept them. For 11 years I kept them, before you had me run out of my office with a warrant written by a judge you owned." He set the first ledger down and picked up the second. "This one covers the debt notices, including the one on this gate. The original loan on this property, Caldwell R. 1882, was paid in full 14 months ago. I have the receipt recorded on page 41. The sheriff turned in his saddle and looked at Vance. It was a small movement. It cracked everything open. "He's lying," Vance said. Louder now. His hand went up. "Take him. Take them both. We'll sort the paperwork before you do that." Nora spoke it quiet enough that the men in front had to lean forward. She reached into her apron pocket and drew out a folded envelope. The paper was good stock, not the paper of a woman who bought her stationery at Greer's General Store. The seal on the back was already broken. "The Honorable Judge Clarence Whitmore," she said, reading the return. "7th District, State of Montana." She looked at Vance. "I've been making the Millfield run twice a week for a month. Not for market." She let that sit for one breath. "The copies went out 3 weeks ago. I had his reply 6 days ago. I've been waiting for you to come to me. From the road far enough out that it started as a feeling in the ground before it became a sound, hoofbeats. Fast, disciplined, evenly spaced. Not a mob. Riders who knew how to ride together. The man next to the Connolly brothers saw them first. He said something low, and the name moved through the crowd like water finding cracks. State Cavalry, and the rifles that had been laid casual across saddles were suddenly being held with much less certainty about where to point them. 8 riders came through the gate in a column. Blue coats. The man at the front had a letter case under his arm, and the look of someone who had ridden hard and was not interested in pleasantries. He pulled up in front of the porch and looked at Nora. "Mrs. Caldwell?" "Captain." He looked at Vance, then at the ledgers on the rail, then back at Vance with the particular expression of a man who has ridden 40 miles and found exactly what he was told he would find. "Harlan Vance," he said, "I have a warrant issued by Judge Whitmore for fraud, land theft, and corruption of public office." He reached into the letter case. "I also have warrants for Sheriff Dolan and one Thomas Greer. He looked at the crowd. Anyone else who'd like to be included is welcome to raise a hand. Nobody raised a hand. Vance's face did something complicated, rage and calculation, and something underneath both of those that was older and smaller. His mouth opened. Silas looked at him from the porch, arms loose at his sides, and said nothing at all. Sometimes silence is the loudest thing a man can carry. They took Vance out the gate in irons just as the last light left the sky. He didn't look back. Men like him never did. Looking back meant admitting there was something worth seeing. The crowd that had ridden in with rifles went out in ones and twos, quiet as smoke clearing after a fire. The Connolly brothers left first, then the ranch hands, then the men who'd nodded to her in the road once and might in time learn to do it again. The sheriff rode out between two cavalry soldiers, his badge already unpinned, sitting loose in his shirt pocket, like something he'd borrowed and was finally returning. The captain shook Nora's hand on the porch steps. He shook Silas's hand too, and held it a moment longer than courtesy required, and said something low that she didn't catch. Silas nodded once. The captain mounted and led his column out, and the sound of 16 hooves on dry road faded north toward Millfield, and then was gone. Pine Creek ran in the dark below the lower field. The gate stood open where the captain's men had left it. Nora walked down and swung it shut and dropped the latch. The notice was still nailed to the post. She worked the nail out with the flat of her thumbnail and the paper free. She folded it twice and put it in her apron pocket. She'd used the back of it for a shopping list. When she came back up to the porch, Silas was in the chair. Not the step, the chair. The one with the curved back that had been her husband's, and that she'd never offered to anyone, and that no one had ever presumed to sit in. He sat in it like a man who has decided where he belongs and stopped arguing with himself about it. His long legs stretched out in front of him, crossed at the boot. The iron box was closed on the rail beside him. One of the ledgers lay open across his knee, and he was writing in the margin with the short pencil he kept behind his ear, fence measurements she could see from the step, and a column of figures that looked like lumber costs. The morning would need a lot of work. The east fence, the barn door hinge, the irrigation channel cover her husband had never gotten around to building. A horse eventually, when the money from the settled claim came through. There would be money, the captain had been clear on that. Restitution from Vance's seized holdings to every landowner he'd wronged. It was a long list. She went inside and put the coffee on. When she came back out with 2 cups, the mountain was a black shape against a sky going purple at the edges, and Iron Ridge caught the first pale suggestion of morning, the way it always did earlier than the valley, holding light longer at both ends of the day. Silas closed the ledger when he heard her step. Pencil went back behind his ear. He took the cup she held out and wrapped both hands around it, the way he'd done that first morning, and the steam came up between them in the cold air. He looked at the ridge. She looked at it too. After a while he said, "That condition you mentioned." She waited. "About the only way you'd take a husband." She took a slow drink of her coffee. It was black and hot, and she'd made it stronger than usual, because it had been that kind of night, and she thought they'd both earned it. "You said I'd have to ask," he said. "I did say that." He turned and looked at her, then full on the way he'd started to that first morning, before the gate latch rang and the world interrupted. The scar along his jaw caught the early light. His eyes were steady and dark, and entirely his own. "Nora Caldwell," he said. "I'm asking." She looked at him for a long moment. The coffee steamed between her hands. The creek ran below. The ridge went from gray to gold as the sun cleared the tree line, slow and certain, the way it did every morning, whether anyone was watching or not. She smiled, not the careful kind she'd been keeping in reserve for 2 years, but the real one, the one that reached all the way up. "Then you already know the answer," she said. He picked up his ledger, opened it back to the fence measurements. But the corner of his mouth had moved, and it stayed moved, and he didn't try to stop it. On the porch at Pine Creek with the coffee hot and the gate latched and the mountain solid at their backs, that was enough. That was more than enough.